All right, class. So we are looking at who is Jesus. Now, again, we may be thinking about the divine Jesus, but here we're just going to focus on the person of Jesus in the stories. So we're going to look at Jesus, we're going to look at history, the culture surrounding Jesus, and then the Jewish archetypes that Jesus lived in. So, Jesus. Now, again, we have the nativity story from Christmas. Jesus was born in a manger, in a barn, because there was no room for him in the inn. But again, this indicates something different about Jesus. First of all, Jesus was out in the rural areas, and his family was probably poor or at least working class. We know that Joseph was a carpenter. Further, Jesus was not born near Jerusalem, he was born out in Galilee, so he wasn't in the center of activity. But we do know that Jesus was a teacher and that he was very proficient in the religious tradition. And he was an itinerant preacher, traveling all the way throughout Judea. But let's get a look at the history. So in 1200 BCE, we know that Israel was enslaved in Egypt. No, not the pyramids. That's right, they were building storehouses for wheat, but they were starving at the same time. And then God liberated them through the waters of the Red Sea and gave them the covenant at Sinai. So slavery in Egypt sits at the core of their story. After that, Israel was in the time of what we call the Judges. They were able to take the land of Canaan, and then they had a time in which they were led by the Torah and judges to restore them, but they moved between slavery and freedom until there was a civil war. And finally, in 900, they established the monarchy. Again, this is Saul, this is David, this is Solomon, all the way through. They built a temple in Jerusalem. They established the Torah as part of their law, but they also played around with the religions within Canaan. So they worship Baal, this little idol here. It was a fertility god that required child sacrifice, and sometimes there were kings who implemented child sacrifice. Further, they forgot about the poor. However, remember, they started out as slaves and poor, so you should remember them. Because of this, in 587, Babylon exiled them. Jerusalem was destroyed. The temple was burned to the ground. The king was out. There was no more land. The only thing left was Torah. And then in 535, Cyrus let them go home. Told them, get out of here. Go back and rebuild. This leads us into the Second Temple period. Again, first they were under Persia. So Israel wasn't their own kingdom during this time. For about 200 years, they were underneath Persia, but they were allowed to rebuild. They had a temple, they had their land, the Torah was back. So it seemed like everything about Israel was back in place. But again, there's no king. And then in 332, Alexander the Great comes about and takes over the entire area. Again, he was Macedonian, which is around the area of Greece, but he took over from Greece into the Middle East, Egypt, Northern Africa, all the way over to India. And then Alexander the Great dies. And so his area gets split up, and two of the major empires are the Ptolemaic in Egypt and the Seleucid in what we know as Syria. Now, after a while, these two people fight constantly over Israel, and finally Antiochus IV in 175 becomes king of the Seleucid Empire. But he's pretty brazen, and so he goes into the Jerusalem, goes into the temple, and puts a pig on the temple altar, which isn't good for Jewish, it's not kosher, sacrifices a pig, and then sets up an idol of himself in the temple. Obviously, this doesn't feel right. So the Jewish people revolt, and this is known as the Maccabean Revolt, led by Judas Maccabeus. After this revolt, in 137, they gained some self-rule under the Hasmonean Empire, where the Maccabees became the rulers. But there was civil war. And so one group wanted a king to rule, the other group really thought it was important for the temple and for a theocracy to rule. So the temple calls out to Rome to come and help them. And Rome helps by taking them over. So again, Israel's occupied in 64 BCE all the way to 70 AD. This is known as the Herodian Empire, in which there was a Roman governor over the king. Rome was over Judah, as well as everywhere else. And then During this time, we get the birth of Jesus. Now, again, Jesus dies at about 37 CE on the cross. And then there's another revolt to be free from Rome. However, Rome does what Rome does, and in 70 CE, Rome destroys Jerusalem, destroys the temple, and sends them back into exile, or known as the diaspora. So we can see that there's these really important parts of Jewish culture. There's the Torah, there's the temple, there's the land that they were promised in the covenant, and there's the kingship. Now, the Pharisees were the keepers of the Torah. They wrote 613 laws for everybody to keep for right living, because right living meant right covenant, and that meant God was going to keep them in the land. The Sadducees were under the temple. They believed that right worship and cleansing of the nation was appropriate, and this kept a good relationship with God, which would keep them in the land. Finally, the Zealots took over, or were keepers of the land. They thought that the covenant and the land were completely tied together, and so they would fight and protect their land from other rulers. But remember, there's no king. So in this place, there's a hope for the Messiah. A leader, it's to lead revolutions, to overthrow, to give them freedom. Honestly, it's to be the warrior that will then become peaceful. Now, Jesus fit all four of these. He was a prophet who fulfilled the Torah by the spirit of the law, not the letter of the law, and he did it through grace. He was a priest, which means that he came to cleanse and heal the people, but remember, he entered the temple, flipped the tables, and let go of the doves, because the doves were supposed to be the free sacrifice of the poor. Afterwards, he then pointed to himself as the way to God, and this is what got him killed. Again, we see Jesus as a king, and the miracles over nature, the casting out of spirits, but again, this king looks different. The last will be first, the servant will be the master, the poor will be over the rich, those sorts of reversals. And so the Messiah is not a warrior. It's a servant who suffers, kind of like what Isaiah said in the Old Testament. This creates God's kingdom in its fulfilled form of what God expected, to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, to be a kingdom of servants that led out and served other people. So Jesus inverted this idea of Messiah. These are the things that we see in the background of Jesus as a person, as a revolutionary, as a leader, of how he fit together within his culture.